Greetings, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as usual, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA. And since tomorrow is Independence Day and will be the 250th birthday of the United States, we are in the semi-quinquentennial, or I forget exactly what it's called, something like that. It's called the semi-quincentennial. I just had to look that up. But anyway, yes, since we are now in the 250th year of America, I figured it would be a good time to discuss the history of some important and iconic American symbols, particularly the American flag, the bald eagle, and the Liberty Bell. So join me as I dive into the history of these important American icons. And I can't think of a better way to open this podcast episode than by first discussing the history of the American flag. That's right, Old Glory itself. When the American Revolution began in 1775, the colonists did not unite under a single flag. The soldiers fought mostly under unit or regimental flags, and one flag of the time featured a picture of a rattlesnake with the slogan, "Don't tread on me," which I think is probably the most famous of these regimental flags, and another showed a pine tree with the words, "An appeal to heaven." This, however, would change in June of 1775 when the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia and created a colonial fighting force called the Continental Army. And some historians claimed that George Washington ordered that a flag called the Continental Colors be raised the following New Year's Day during a siege of British-occupied Boston, Massachusetts. Continental colors contained 13 alternating red and white stripes with a Union Jack in the upper left-hand corner. And if anyone is wondering, the Union Jack is the symbol on the British flag. Washington would later realize, however, that it probably was not a good idea to have a flag that resembled the flag of the enemy. Yeah, I could see how that might lead to friendly fire. And during this time, the Second Continental Congress was drafting a constitution called the Articles of Confederation, which sought an alliance with France in supplying the war effort. However, on June 14, 1777, the Second Continental Congress took time from its schedule to pass a resolution stating that, quote, "the flag of the United States be 13 stripes, alternate red and white, and that the Union be 13 stars, white in a blue field, representing a new constellation." To this very day, however, no one knows for sure who designed the first American flag. Legend says that Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag in 1776 after being asked by George Washington. However, there is very little evidence to prove this to be the case. And I think it should be noted that each color of the American flag has a meaning. Red stands for valor and bravery, white is purity and innocence, and blue is vigilance, perseverance, and justice. And the first major design change to happen to the American flag was in 1795 when Vermont and Kentucky joined the Union, and Congress updated the flag the only way that seemed fair at the time, a star and a stripe for each new state. And the 1795 flag carried 15 of each. And interestingly, it was this flag that Francis Scott Key saw flying over Fort McHenry that inspired him to write the Star-Spangled Banner. And I think it should be noted that that particular flag still exists, and the National Museum of American History has undertaken a long-term preservation act of the enormous flag that survived the 24 shelling of Fort McHenry in Baltimore, Maryland. And the flag has become soiled and weakened over time and was removed from the museum in December of 1998. And the preservation effort began in June 1999 and still continues to this day. And the flag is now stored at a 10-degree angle in a special low-oxygen filtered light chamber and is periodically examined at microscopic level to detect signs of decay and damage within the individual fibers of the flag. And as more states were added to the Union during this time, it posed a problem to flag design. I mean, if a stripe was added for every state, after a while, the stripes would get very, very thin. More states being added to the Union, New York Representative Peter Wendover in 1816 wanted to update the flag, and he chaired a committee and forced debates in the House until the Flag Act, as it was called, was approved. And by 1817, there were 20 states in the Union. And so, on April 4th, 1818, the Flag Act was approved by President James Monroe, and it restored the original design of 13 stripes and provided that each state would be represented by one star. And President Monroe ordered that the flag stars be arranged in 4 rows of 5 stars each. However, his instructions would not always be followed. And by 1859, a 33-star flag represented the United States. And just 2 years later, the Stars and Stripes flew in a Flag Day celebration for the first time at Hartford, Connecticut during the first summer of the Civil War. And the 34-star flag became official July 4th, and it signified the admission of the state of Kansas into the Union. And 2 more states, being West Virginia and Nevada, would be added before the war's end, which brought the total to 36 states. And from 1867 to 1896, 9 more states would be added into the Union, and so 9 more states were added to the flag. And Flag Day would soon gain national support in 1885 when a Wisconsin teacher named Bernard Cigrand, or I hope I'm pronouncing that right, maybe it's Kigrand, maybe it's a hard C, originated the idea for a Flag Day. And just 4 years later, President Woodrow Wilson issued a proclamation that established a nationwide observance of Flag Day on June 14th, which was the anniversary of the Flag Resolution of 1777. And in 1949, President Truman signed legislation that designated June 14th of each year as National Flag Day. Here's something I find interesting, and I hope you will too. In 1912, President William Howard Taft signed an executive order that clarified what the American flag should look like. Up until then, some flags were oddly proportioned, having 6 or 8 pointed stars. The design now, of course, has 5 pointed stars. Another major milestone in flag design would happen in 1959 when President Dwight D. Eisenhower issued executive orders establishing the official designs of the 49 and 50-star flag following the admissions of Alaska and Hawaii into the Union. And another important symbol to America is, of course, our national bird, and that is the bald eagle. How did this become our national bird, you ask? Well, shortly after July 4th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, Continental Congress gave Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams the job of designing an official seal for the new country. However, the Founding Fathers failed to come up with a design that won Congress's approval, as did 2 later committees that were given the task. In June of 1782, however, the work of all 3 committees was handed over to the Secretary of Congress, Charles Thomson. He chose what he thought were the best elements of the various designs and made the eagle, which had been introduced by a Pennsylvania lawyer named William Barton, and since ancient times the eagle has been considered a sign of strength. Roman legions used the animal as their symbol. And interestingly, originally, Barton's design was a small white eagle. Charles Thomson, the Secretary of Congress, recommended that be replaced with a bald eagle. And so, on June 20th, 1782, Congress adopted that design. And so, from then on, the great American seal showed a bald eagle gripping arrows and an olive branch with the phrase E pluribus unum underneath it. And anyone wondering, E pluribus unum is a Latin phrase meaning out of many, one. And the phrase has 13 letters, which symbolizes the original 13 colonies that would become united to form a new nation. And contrary to what you may have heard in school or online, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Benjamin Franklin suggested that a turkey become our national bird and be featured on the Great American Seal. However, in a 1784 letter to his daughter, he did call the bald eagle a bird of bad moral character. And the bird has faced some hardships, I'm sad to say. In the late 1800s, the United States was home to 100,000 nesting bald eagles, but the number of birds soon dwindled due to factors like habitat destruction and hunting. Eagles have long been seen as threats to livestock and fisheries, and during this time there weren't any protections in place to stop the killing of bald eagles. However, it was not until the 1940s and 50s that the bald eagle population truly collapsed. What caused the collapse, you ask? A pesticide called DDT which has a very long name, and I'm not going to pronounce the entire thing, so DDT it is. And although it did not kill the bald eagles directly, it did make their eggs too fragile to survive incubation. And by 1963, there were just 417 known nesting bald eagle pairs left in the United States. In some areas, the entire generations failed to hatch. And so how did we save the bald eagle? Well, there were multiple steps to it. In 1967, the bald eagle was listed under what would later become the Endangered Species Act, and in 1972, DDT was banned in the United States. And in 1973, the Endangered Species Act became law, and it offered new protections and funding for eagle recovery. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service launched nationwide conservation efforts, monitoring nests, reintroducing eagles to historic ranges, and protecting critical habitats. By 2007, the bald eagle had recovered enough to be removed from the federal endangered species list. Another popular American symbol, of course, is the Liberty Bell. And I think it started out just as a bell commissioned by the colonial legislature of Pennsylvania to hang in the steeple of the State House, which is now known as Independence Hall. And in 1752, so that the city would have a bell with great carrying power to announce the meetings of legislature and toll for notable events. It was cast in London, and it cracked at its first testing, at which point two artisans in Philadelphia named John Pass and John Stowe recast the bell. And during the American Revolution, the State House became an accomplice in revolutionary politics. It rang in 1765 to warn people of the approach of an English ship sailing up the Delaware River to deliver stamped paper for implementing the Stamp Act. It rang in 1768 to attract thousands gathering to protest the townshend duties. And again it rang to assemble the citizens of Philadelphia in 1773 for a town meeting to protest the Tea Act. And again in 1774, the bell summoned the locals of Philadelphia to protect the Coverse Act. And on July 8, 1776, the bell is thought to have rang as people massed in the State House yard to hear the Sheriff of Philadelphia read the Declaration of Independence. The bell did not ring during the British occupation of the city in 1777 because the locals knew that the British would melt it down and make it into bullets to be aimed at American soldiers. So they wrestled it down from the State House steeple and carried it by wagon to Allentown, Pennsylvania. However, it was back in the city of Philadelphia to ring the British surrender at Yorktown on October 24th, 1781, and to announce the signing of the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain on April 15, 1783. The bell would escape death again in 1812 when Philadelphia officials considered demolishing the rotting hulk of the State House, which had lost its function since the state capital had moved to Harrisburg. But the city brokered a deal in 1816 to acquire the old State House and the bell from the state of Pennsylvania. And 8 years later, when the Marquis de Lafayette made his tour through the United States, the bell began to acquire a new life, largely through the publicity paid to the crumbling State House. And Lafayette was received in an East Room, where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of 1787 had been signed, around mass celebrations and a new interest in the Revolutionary era. And now the State House was called Independence Hall, and it became sacred ground, so to speak. And then in the 1830s, when New York and Boston abolitionists were attracted to the bell's inscription about proclaiming freedom throughout the land, took the bell as an emblem of the growing rampage to abolish slavery. And the New York Anti-Slavery Society's anti-slavery record renamed the old bell the Liberty Bell. The bell would crack again in 1843 after almost 100 years of ringing. The crack occurred when it rang in remembrance of George Washington's birthday. Once damaged, it rested on the floor of Independence Hall, and it soon went on tours. After the Civil War, it became an important message of reconciliation between the North and the South. In 1885, the bell was invited by organizers of New Orleans' World's Industrial and Cotton Exposition, and so the bell was scrubbed and polished and carried on an elaborately decorated flat car for a 4-day trip to New Orleans, Louisiana. and at each stop people gathered to touch, stroke, and even kiss the bell as the train made its way to Louisiana. And once installed, it transfixed visitors for nearly 5 months and reached iconic status. And it was then sent to Chicago's World Columbia Expedition in 1893. And on April 29th of that year, 13 black horses escorted the bell to Chicago, or to be more specific, the White City. Hundreds of buildings erected on the shore of Lake Michigan. The procession stretched for 2 miles. By the time of its return to Philadelphia in November of 1893, roughly 1/3 of the nation had seen it. And one of its last trips was to San Francisco, California, and San Diego, California in 1915, in the midst of a world engulfed in the First World War. However, never again would the bell leave the city of Philadelphia after that. It did, however, leave Independence Hall. In 1976, the National Park Service moved the Liberty Bell from Independence Hall, where it had been for almost 2 centuries, to a glass and brick pavilion facing Independence Hall about a block away. And then in 2003, it found a new home in its exhibit building at 6th and Market Street, and visitors to the Liberty Bell average 1.5 million annually. And with that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to sign off now, folks. What have we learned today? Well, for one thing, I think we've learned that everything changes. After all, I mean, just look at the various redesigns that the American flag has undergone over these years. And I think we've also learned that the American bald eagle can be seen as a great symbol for this country because of resilience. After all, it took a while for it to be taken off the endangered species list. This is indeed a great nation that has endured much. And the Liberty Bell has been with us all through these years. With that, I now say goodbye, God bless, and may God bless America.